Hi, we're now back, and I want to talk about the composition of abstract painting. When you're painting a subject that is realistic, it's kind of easier to arrange your shapes on a page because the subject matter lends itself to a centrally focused image. But when you're working with abstraction, it gets a little bit more tricky to how to arrange the shapes in the page. And so what I'd like you to do is follow along with me with a presentation about the different ways in which artists can compose and arrange shapes onto a canvas, and how Georgia O'Keeffe used those techniques in her abstract paintings. And this will help you arrange the shapes in your abstract painting. So although it's not overly realistic, it still follows the rules of composition. And so I'm going to share my screen now and show you a presentation about arranging shapes on a page. And so what I have here is a very old school image of how to use the elements of art to arrange an interesting composition. One of the reasons why I use this old school sheet is because I want you to know these rules have not changed. Although the style of art has changed, the way we put paint on a canvas has changed. The subject of what we paint has changed. The qualities that make for a good work of art, something that follows the elements of design, do not change. And those are rules for art that last the centuries. And so we still want to follow those rules, even though we're working in a less representational format. And so first, I'd like to start with symmetry. Symmetry is one of the most common uses of composition, and that's when you have a centrally focused image and a somewhat balanced, it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced, but an image on either side. And you can see from the four paintings that I showed you by Georgia O'Keeffe, some of her realistic ones are definitely symmetrical, the skull in the middle, two horns on either side. And as she went into her abstraction, she then had a central line down the middle of her painting, and the forms balanced on one side or the other. The next shape you might want to consider when doing a composition is the classic triangle. The classic triangle shows balance and is used in the Renaissance times and throughout history to create a beautiful arrangement of shapes that has a smaller shapes at the top and stronger shapes at the bottom. And so Georgia O'Keeffe did this in mountain ranges, did these in leaves, and even had a triangular shape with her abstracted spirals. And so a classic shape is definitely the triangle in compositions. The next is that central circle. A lot of people resort to this as their go-to compositional element because it takes the focal point and puts it right in the middle of the paper. Sometimes that can be a little boring if it's too symmetrical, and you have to be careful with that, but it does make for a balanced composition when you have a strong focal point right in the middle of the painting, as you can see in the black center of the poppy, on these centers of these lilies, and even in some of her abstractions. She took a central point and put it right in the middle. It wasn't it perfectly symmetrical, but it definitely gives you that bullseye focal point. The next one is a cross. It's similar to symmetrics, but it doesn't have to be perfectly even. It's the idea that two major images or directional lines, whether they're shapes or colors or lines, divide in the middle, creating an X. It can be a literal cross like she put here, or it could be these X cross-like shapes that divide the canvas into four equal parts. The next and a more dynamic composition is called the S. The S shape moves your eye through a canvas, and it can be something as literal as this beautiful river that leads your eye into the distance of the landscape, or it can be just the way shapes are arranged on a page, like these beautiful shells can form an S shape as you go through it. Landscapes also have S shapes with roads and rivers and other directional lines. And so you can create an S shape through shapes, or through the way that you put your brush strokes down can create that type of S-shaped pattern that leads your eye deeper into the canvas. There's also the radiating star. The radiating star kind of has that center point, like the center circle, but it doesn't end there. It radiates out into other pieces that draw your eye to the outer corners of the canvas. And so you can see something as simple as this one is a true radial star because it's a radial design, but you can see, like with the aloe plant and with some of her other poppies and lily flowers and even this tree, all Georgia O'Keeffe paintings, you can see how she starts with that center point and radiates some of her lines out so that your eye can go back into the center and back to the edges and doesn't stay in a stagnant place. An L shape is another common landscape composition. It is often like a tree line and a fence, and we have to add this dot because you can't just have an L without having something interesting in that space. And so you can see how these trees create this L with this orange, or this is kind of a backwards L, that these greener and blue shapes on the right balance out that circle shape on the bottom. And here is a diagonal. A diagonal often creates a very dynamic composition. And so diagonals are more interesting than straight lines. And so Georgia O'Keeffe often used diagonals, whether it's a tree branch or the spine of a leaf or part of a bone, or it can go in any direction, but it kind of divides up the space and makes it more dynamic versus a strong vertical. And that is the last one. And so as you start to compose your picture, I want you to actually think about what particular shape you're going to use as your overall composition. I don't want it to be like nilly-willy. I want you to kind of plan it a little bit. Am I going to use a strong diagonal? Am I going to use a triangle? Am I going to radiate some of my lines coming out so that you don't fall back into something that's just a center focus, and that you're actually considering different ways in which you can arrange your shapes on the paper.